So we have about an hour left here. So we're going to spend that time going through in detail these lessons that we learned and talking about, how we did with each of them and our experience. And then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for some questions after that. But we'll stop in between here to check for questions along the way. So we'll go ahead and get started on that. So Chris already introduced, the 6 key lessons learned from the planning and design part of this DSP project. And so, he presented those to you all. And so now we're going to take them one by one and go into them a little bit deeper and talk about what we did and what we didn't do in terms of each of these key lessons learned. So the first one was that it is really important to clearly define the management that you want to compare. So like we just heard from Alexandra and from Corey, we felt like this was accomplished in our project. And so management contrasts can be, very extreme, or they can be more subtle. And we'll go into some examples of that here in a minute. But the important thing that, the important lesson learned that we took from this is that if you're trying to assess the impact of more subtle management contrasts, it's going to take a lot more reps. It's going to take more research. It's going to take more rigor, just overall more effort, more time to assess those subtle management contrasts. And so it's really important in that to know what your purpose is and to know what resources you have available while you're trying to define the managements you want to compare. That definitely can vary greatly depending on which managements you choose. So it's important to make sure that they match up and that overall it will match the purpose that you have for your DSP project. And so just to give you just some ideas of some of the managements that you could have for a DSP project, you can have a perennial mixed grass field that's managed as a pasture, which may be one of your managements. You might have one that is a crop field that has annual crops, but it's no-till. They use high biomass cover crops. It's kind of they incorporate a lot of conservation practices into their management. And then on the extreme end, you can have a cropping system where there are annual crops with conventional tillage and no cover crops. So if we think about these 3 management categories that we have here, you can think about, how much the 4 soil health principles are being applied in each of these systems. So, to the left with the pasture, they're being incorporated more than on the right side, which the other extreme is where they're not being followed or incorporated into that management system very much at all. And so you can see in the next slide, I'm going to show an example of some management contrast that you could choose and talk about how when you're trying to assess the impact within one of these categories or between these categories, it's going to make your project very different. And so, for example, if you were trying to compare the 2 sites at the top, you have a mixed grass pasture, manages pasture versus another pasture that's perennials, but you're trying to tease out those subtle differences in management. So, the same system, they're just managed differently. So differences in, grazing intensity and, rotational grazing versus continuous, kind of what we did. It's going to be much more difficult. It's going to require more resources, time, and effort. Versus if we were looking at this bottom comparison, so if we were looking at, like we said, that compared the extreme of having a cropping system with conventional tillage and no cover crops, no conservation practices really, versus pasture that has perennial mixed grasses, and just logically it's going to be much easier to find those differences in this extreme case versus in the more subtle case here. And so now we're going to talk about how did we do in the Valley DSP project. So I should have said this at the beginning, but the way this is set up is that, I'm going to talk about what does this lesson learned mean, and then we're going to get into, okay, how did we do in our project and what did it look like for us? And so for our project, like I said, Alexandra and Corey talked about, they did a good job. Alexandra painted this picture of, hey, I want to have pastures that are managed intensively, that have good management. You think about NRCS practices, prescribed grazing, that type of system versus one that has poor management, continuous grazing, overgrazing. That she did clearly define what she wanted. So we felt like this was a success. But like we said, the more subtle the management contrast, the more rigor it's going to require. So that was the first point. I guess I can stop here to see real quick if there were any questions on that one before we get into the next or comments.
I assume that with your management comparisons, you've already said that you were keying on the soil series Frederick, but it might be important to re-emphasize the fact that we're looking at different managements on hopefully the same basic soil types.
Yeah, that's definitely important to keep in mind. And that's why we'll talk about it later, but I think that's why it's important to have a good team put together so that we have people like Carl, like Alexandra, like Chris, they're soil scientists and can be there to confirm and make sure that we are in, the same soil series, same soil types. That way we can be holding that constant. So that is a very important part of this. Good comment, Carl.